G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and look, thank you for the feedback on the video yesterday. I know it was rough because I'm feeling incredibly rough at the moment. Today is 2 days after the last round, at least of this round of chemotherapy, and it's typically at day 2 where I get the worst and I feel the most toxic from, I guess, the poison that is going into me. But thank you very much. Now today we have a lot to talk about. I want to, of course, as always, we look over the maps and see where things are changing and see where different maps are showing differences, and it gives us an idea of where that front line or where actions are taking place. Anyone who got to the end of the video yesterday knows that I missed probably half of the video. I want to look over a speech from NATO Secretary Mark Rutte, and then I actually want to overlay that with another podcast I've listened to between Professor Mearsheimer and Alexander Dugin. And what I want to take away is where there are some consistencies and where there are inconsistencies, and where the future, I guess, holds in this, and where I believe that the NATO Secretary may be missing the forest through the trees on some things. And of course, I want to talk about North Korean soldiers as more footage is coming out today. But I always have a long-winded introduction to these. Now, boys, I had a bit of a moment last night and I just couldn't sleep. But I had a moment of a reminder that we need to really look after each other. And I got up, I just felt crap, and I went just for a walk down to the end of my street, and I saw like a body lying there, and I wasn't sure if it was a homeless guy or like a body. So I checked to see if he was okay, which thankfully he was, and ended up sitting there and having like an hour-long D&M. Anyone who's not a millennial, deep and meaningful, which I think we both really needed. Now, I'm incredibly privileged to be in a period of my life where I'm able to help himself be more comfortable for a few days. But I think everyone just needs to remember that we are all human and we all go through peaks and troughs in our lives, and we need to look after each other. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, that I've never met an individual, and everywhere I've been in my life and people I've spoken to and everything, I've never met an evil individual. I'm sure they exist, but it's the 0.0001%. But I have seen true evil emerge in groups driven by ideologies, fostering a herd mentality. And one of the recent philosophies I've been thinking about a lot is that anything from religion, politics, government, education, anything that promises a utopia at the end will do truly evil things in its imaginary path to utopia. And this falls in line with one of my favourite authors, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but I will paraphrase a bit here. To achieve its utopia, communism will justify any crime, even the murder of children. And I think that you can exchange the word communism there with any word. Anything that's promising a utopia will justify the most horrendous crimes. So I guess, what do we take away from this? Do we not need to look up and forward? And that's of course not. Of course, we should always be looking forward and up and the betterment of ourselves and those around us. But we need to accept, I believe, that life is a struggle with brief moments of individual utopia that if you're lucky enough to share with others, then that is the point of life. Okay, legends, I apologise. I just wanted to share what's on my mind, and I really hope that my newly found friend is doing really well. So, look, let's start with these North Koreans. Now, what I shared with you yesterday was I basically said the evidence that I've seen, I just don't see that as beyond reasonable doubt. And the reason why I have such a high threshold is because of the amount of lies about everything throughout this war so far, from individuals, from bloggers, from news channels, from MODs. And that's why I have such a threshold for anything coming out of the Russian ministry or at this, and for the last year or so out of the Ukrainian ministry as well. And I think there has been a little bit of pushback on this, and I'm not sure if this was aimed at myself, but either way, I just want to talk about this from one of, I believe, the best bloggers in this circle, Tachiragami UA, who I mentioned I'd love to have on a podcast to just discuss anything. Let's go to the first one. Proving to pro-Russians that North Koreans are fighting against Ukraine is pointless. Show them actual footage with Koreans and they'll say it's Asian Russians. When the Pentagon confirms it, they say it's propaganda. No matter the evidence, they'll simply move the goalposts. And this is a concern here. And what I say is when asking for evidence makes you one way or the other, that's when you have real issues. When asking for evidence becomes that you're a propagandist, you're this or that, that is a huge problem. And what I state is that for months, officials, bloggers, media, everything has been saying that North Korean troops have been deserting en masse and they've been dying for months. But now the story is that they've just arrived in Kursk. And it raises the same question to what we heard earlier in the war about Afghanis, Indians and Africans who were joining the war to fight, and then it sort of just peters out. And what I've actually said, and I've said this for weeks now, is that I actually believe that it's very highly likely that North Koreans will join the fight and or are fighting. But what is presented at the point, to me, was not beyond reasonable doubt. And I also shared a Russian source about how North Koreans are using North Korean artillery systems rather than Russians being trained up on that system then a while back. And this threshold comes from, say, things like Russian claims around destroyed HIMARS or Patriots, or Western soldiers, or Ukrainian claims about downed fighter jets or false flags, or all of this. At this point in time, I question it all, and I have to question it all because it's a byproduct of years of claims with no evidence being presented in a lot of cases. And it's this that I'm talking about. Once Ukraine captures its first North Korean PWs, hopefully not South Korean PWs, that would be an international incident, expect the following narratives. They're South Korean actors, they're North Korean defectors, it's a single volunteer, or it's AI. And no matter the evidence, the goalposts will be shifted. And I push back on this and say this would be the threshold for me. If there was clear evidence of a North Korean PW, not someone who looks Asian, who the video a month back was speaking Ukrainian, as well as Russian pages confirming that North Koreans are fighting. And I've only seen very cryptic things. This is from one of the larger ones, this Intel Slava Z. Soldiers from the DPRK, North Korea, captured by Ukrainian drone Kursk region, one of the first objective confirmations of participation of North Korean soldiers in battle. These fighters can attribute to many Asian peoples of Russia, but the soldiers face a more typical Korean type, and unafraid reactions to drones in their shots says a lot. So again, take that as you will. It's a bit cryptic, but it tends to be confirming that. Now, South Korean actors, the pushback on this would be if South Korea had signed those weapons deals between Ukraine and South Korea, this would hold up a lot. But we have seen that South Korea has pushed back, and that is still a no from rising tensions with Russia. My biggest red flag, and the reason why I hold this at a high threshold, is always the question of who would benefit more. Russia, with over 1 million soldiers, with a few thousand guys coming in who can't speak the language, or Ukraine on this, that they then have received out of this long-range strikes, way more international support, as a third country has entered, more sanctions have been applied to Russia. And the big one, of course, which we just spoke about, which hasn't come through, is access to South Korea's military-industrial complex, which is absolutely massive. And do not underestimate how powerful companies like Hanwha are on the global scale of military industry. And then furthermore, I want to talk about a few things in this, because this is exactly what we applied the opposite way to when we heard about Ukrainian forces in Syria. We had footage like this from Russians saying 100% certainty that there are Ukrainian operators training drone pilots. And we added the same level of skepticism when they started claiming this, claiming that operators were in Syria working with HTS. We saw the drone usage, we saw the footage, but this wasn't beyond reasonable doubt. It wasn't until the Ukrainian media started confirming this with inside sources, and then Ukrainian groups, they were sharing this image here, then we said that this had become highly likely. This war is an informational minefield with state-level actors at play, all the way down to just hardcore individuals operating by themselves. Ukraine, Russia, and the West, at least the West in its rhetoric, see this war as existential. Now, I don't believe the West see this as existential, because what they say versus their actions doesn't show this at all. But I have no doubt that by any means necessary will be taken to put X country in the best possible position. So I guess the too long didn't read is, as I've stated, I believe that North Koreans may enter the battlefield. I think today more footage is coming out, maybe showing that they are. But does anything here go beyond reasonable doubt? No. And at this point in time, as an observer of this war, an observer of many blatant lies coming out from either side here, I always hold everything with a grain of salt until it reaches a very high threshold. I know that may paint me in one column or the other, whatever, but I'm holding things to a very high threshold because these are very important things. And it does fall in line with what I shared from a Russian source who basically said the Koreans, they're operating their artillery systems and this could be true. And then we have a former Ukrainian serviceman here saying, unfortunately, North Korean troops in Kursk region has been somewhat successful. I can't say that there is a breakthrough, but they seem to be fresh and willing to die. They're using different tactics, which we will need to adapt to. And this is one of these things, is fresh and willing to die. Well, these guys will have had a lifetime of propaganda, and they're not exposed to the absolute savagery of this war on social media or seen the horrors of war through society. I'd say it's a very closed bubble. Something we do need to talk about up in Kursk with, they've had somewhat success. Well, we'll have a look at the maps in 1 second. Is it a mix? Is it not a mix? Is it one way or the other? And they did take, apparently, several trench lines. The way I would see this implemented, if we do, is a mix. Very similar to how the coalition would work with the Afghan National Army, is you work with some of the locals and you then mix in other more trained elements as a bit of a guide, what we would call like a mentoring task force for on-the-ground actions. So at this point, I think it's highly likely that what we're seeing are North Koreans in the fight. And like we said earlier, it will if they are entering the fight, it will be in Kursk, because then Russia can go, well, this is within our border, our internationally recognised borders. If we want to talk about internationally recognised borders, that's where I say the border is. So I do believe that it is likely that we have seen North Koreans enter the battlefield. But we've been hearing that they've entered the battlefield now for months. Like I said, deserting, being killed, this or that. The Pentagon says this. But again, so hard to know because there's been just so many claims made that have been accepted by one side or the other with no evidence provided on so much of that, that now my threshold is so high. But let's look at where this guy was talking about the success up in Kursk. So of course we have the Ukraine map here, the deep state map. Here's the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Of course, the red check you're going to see on this map is ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. But where we'll be coming is up into the blue. Now the blue on every other area within Ukraine's borders is where Ukraine has made ground over the past 2 weeks. Of course, into Kursk is where Ukraine is occupying back into Russia. Now, the pity on this map is it doesn't show where Ukraine was at one point. But if we scroll back to yesterday, we see the footage, we see where the map is sitting here, and then scroll forward and we can see where this has moved. So let's say it's right on the corner of this tree line to here. There's been about a 4-kilometre increase. Now the footage, some of the geolocated footage of the claimed North Koreans was just in this tree line around here. Again, we can see advancements in this area, and then this is further confirmed by multiple Syriac maps. So we have a look on the Syriac map, and he's showing a very similar area. The Russian army advanced the direction of Kremennoy and Korodenovsky district, entering Sudzha district, taking control over these areas. So we can confirm there was definitely an advancement there. The problem with this map is it doesn't show where Ukraine was at one point. Remember, they were knocking on the door of Korenovo through Stongost and Lubimovkia at one point in time. Syriac says this: Ukrainian army controls now less than 500 square kilometres in Kursk, half of the maximum expansion achieved in August on Russian territory. And I believe things in here over winter are going to get more and more difficult logistically. Those that say that Ukraine has the logistics advantage in Kursk, I have not had a good argument back for that yet, and I'm open to any argument that says that Ukraine will have a logistical advantage in here, because I don't see it, even in my most wild imagination, with one road in and out, and of course having Kursk, train lines, everything here, and the exact same side of if someone said Russia has better logistics out to, Pokrovsk area than Ukraine does, I'd also push back on that with the ability of drones and everything to strike further back. With this being, say around 500 square kilometers, the use case for this at the negotiating table is very, very limited. So let's look at some other areas on the front line, and we'll turn this back on and have a look. So where we need to come down is, well, I call it Ilininkia front, but we're well beyond that. It's right back here. We'll call this just, I guess, the Kurakhove front. We can see that Hadnivkia, Uspenivkia, Trudove, these areas are currently closing up. There was a large salient in here for a while, and that is closing up, as well as Russian movements through Kurakhove and to the south as well. So let's see where this is all lining up. So this is what we see here. Of course, the Syriac map showed yesterday that this Hadnivkia Trudove front had then collapsed, been enveloped and collapsed. And we did say that this Zelenivkia, this movement wasn't shown by Syriac, and he's showing that today. Remember, right out where my cursor is at the moment. So these maps showing fairly similar, but not as much ground through Trudove or Uspenivkia. We have a Noel reports around Trudove, Uspenivkia, and he's showing more similarly to the Syriac map that Trudove, Uspenivkia has come under Russian control, which, looking at these maps, looking at the amount of grey zone and the flanks here, I'm not surprised one piece by this. So let's move across west a little bit, and we see Velika Novoselivka. Now, this is creating a massive problem if this map is correct. If this map is correct and that Ukrainian forces are still in Makarivkia, they are currently getting encircled, if not encircled already. There's 1 kilometer at the absolute maximum here. As you can see, that Russia has expanded further. That could potentially surround and cut off an amount of soldiers in there, which is what we have seen happen time and time again. And I know people are very, very frustrated with this continually happening. Although Syriac paints a different picture. He shows that the Russians have only reached to where this waterway is here, and that the Ukrainians are able to withdraw from Makarivkia to Starozevi. So again, these two maps are painting a slightly different picture. The Ukrainian map actually paints a worse picture than the Syriac. I believe these forces, if they haven't pulled out, will be trying to pull out at the moment, and there will be counterattacks in here to try and open up that if guys are stuck. It is something that we see again and again, whether it was from Mariupol to Avdiivka to Bakhmut to, you can name a whole bunch of others, where it is left way too late, and then the withdrawal has, in my opinion, very unnecessary casualties. And this, of course, all goes into psychological impact on guys at the front, but also for people who will then not volunteer or who are being conscripted. And we come up into the Pokrovsk front. Now, this can be hard because some areas in here look very different. Just to give you a quick few reference points, this red dot right here, that is Zeleny, Lisivkia is this one. Of course, then we have Shevchenko and Novotroitsky as well. So we can see some ground made out to the west of Shevchenko on the deep state, but we switch across on Syriac, and it says Russian army made new advances west of Novotroitsky, south of Dashnevsky, and southwest of Pushkini. In addition, Russian forces made a series of advances west of Krasny Yar along the railway towards Minograd. So we have Krasny Yar right up here. Then we have where these railways both sit, where it splits off in here, that there was advancement there, as well as straight up from Novohorovka as well. Legends, I apologize if there's a lot of cuts in this. I'm really, really struggling primarily with my word recall at the moment. So we'll keep moving up. And then we have the Pishani front, where we saw Ukraine have a successful counterattack around Kolesnivkia in here. And I have said this is critical. I think Ukraine need to counterattack to somehow stop the Russians in here, because it is really putting a lot of strain on all the Ukrainian forces around Losova. And if we zoom out one, you'll see what I mean. You can just see the extension on the logistics. And of course, we saw that 5 or 6 kilometer advancement over the past few days, exactly, in my opinion, because of this. Now, I think we'll see more counterattacks here. I think we have to. And we have Syriac confirming these attacks today. And look, to be honest, these maps are showing very, very similar at this point in time. So successful attack there. Then we move down towards then Terny. So we have Toretski, we have Terny in here, and we have the Suryak map showing that near Terny, the Russians have made more ground. See where this tree line is? This is then this tree line. So basically right up into here, what would be an advancement, if correct, of about 1.7 kilometers, just about a mile beyond what this map is showing at this point in time. But as well, like I say, with everything, take it with a grain of salt. Now, I want to share just some news here. This is from Noel Reports, but Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for Europe and Euro-Atlantic integration dismissed claims that lowering the mobilisation age being influenced by US officials, saying this isn't a petition, it's reality. Soldiers must be equipped. I see it as an attempt to shift responsibility for past agreements, but I see this as an attempt to shift responsibility the other way for the shortages that are created. As a former infantry soldier, your best infantry soldiers, not your NCOs, not your officers, and not special forces troops, but your best infantry soldiers sit right in that bracket of 18 to 25. If they weren't, why would all militaries in the world target people with their advertisements in high school? As far as fitness, your ability to be molded both mentally and physically as well, it sits right there. I understand that these people are Ukraine's future, but we're told that Ukraine doesn't have a future without a victory, that this is an existential war. And this becomes what I refer to as the manpower paradox, that without these people, Ukraine has no future, that they are Ukraine's future to have children and repopulate and grow Ukraine into the great state it can be. But we're also told then without a victory, that this isn't going to happen. So it's in between this. If you don't mobilise them, Ukraine may not win. I do not believe that they'll win if they're not mobilised. Even if they are mobilised, I question it, especially with the timeframes given between the new administration coming in and what we're seeing on the battlefield. But at the same time, if they are mobilised, well then of course there's a huge risk there. It's a massive problem. This is the paradox. What I will say is, though, that on the front line in attritional war is the more people you have is actually the less people that you will lose, because you're a greater fighting force, therefore you will lose less people. And this is the paradox of manpower that I just don't understand in Ukraine at the moment, saying that this is existential. If we don't win the battlefield, we will lose everything, but not willing to then mobilise where your best soldiers will fit. Now, of course, a lot of people in those age brackets have already volunteered. And of course, the amount of people sitting in those age brackets is still very small. But the non-willingness to do it does pop up red flags for, we see, of course, the American administration. Now, this is the part of the video that I missed yesterday, where I believe the forest of the trees isn't really being seen. And what I wanted to overlay was what Mearsheimer and Dugan say compared to what Mark Rutte has said, and where the similarities and where there isn't, and some important points. Now, whether you vehemently disagree or agree with this, I think is regardless of, there's some important things said in this and important perspectives to add of how something may be seen. And Mearsheimer makes a good point here, that he argues strategy isn't about what you think. It's about being able to understand what your adversary is thinking. And that is a very, very important point when analysing something like this. Another important point in this is both Professor Mearsheimer and Dugan both agree that Russia is a formidable fighting force, but is not powerful enough to contemplate invading NATO. Now, for those of you who are unaware who Dugan is, and some will say he's Putin's brains, Putin's philosopher, there is no actual evidence that he has met Putin. I'm sure that he has. I don't know how much sway there may be, but what I said right in the beginning of this video is one of the most dangerous things is ideology. And what Dugan does is he does present to a lot of people a new ideology that some see as the way forward and some see as very extreme. In this, they both talk how Russia supports Trump's stance against things like cancel culture, and they support his traditionalist values. However, they both criticise him for failing to consider the realistic situation on the battlefield. Like I said, they both agree that although Russia is formidable, they're not powerful enough to contemplate invading NATO, nor has that actually been said. That's a point we need to look when we talk about what the NATO secretary has said. Russia views NATO expansion as an existential threat and is prepared to fight to the death over it. So what they talk about here is strategy, being able to understand what your adversary is thinking. They say on this point a lot that Russia views this as an existential threat. It doesn't matter how you view it, how do they view this? That is an important part to take when you're developing strategy, is you need to be able to understand what they are thinking. Even if you disagree with that assessment, you need to understand that to then make predictions or to understand what is being done. NATO, however, seems to underestimate how deeply Russia perceives Ukraine joining NATO as a critical threat. It doesn't matter what NATO believes, it matters how Russia perceives the situation. And this goes back into what I spoke about as strategy. And this is what these guys are saying. I'm just sort of shorthanding it here. Mearsheimer explains that an existential threat to a nuclear power like Russia doesn't just mean the destruction of Russia or Ukraine. It means the destruction of everyone. Of course, here talking about nuclear weapons, and him saying that no, they are deadly serious about this because of how they see this as existential, that people underestimate how much Russia see this as a threat. Again, they criticised Trump for not considering the realistic situation at the time. This is the point Putin is trying to emphasise. As he said, a world without Russia will not be tolerated. If we fail to exist, so will you. So pushing on this idea of defeating Russia, strategically defeating Russia, and how they say Putin sees this as that's existential, and if we won't exist, that won't be tolerated. Neither will you. Mearsheimer and Dugan agree that the war will ultimately be settled on the battlefield. Mearsheimer adds that the conditions that Putin has put forward are not conditions that any American administration would ever accept. So he's saying what's being put forward, no administration would accept this, no way, so then it will be decided on the battlefield. And of course, that's going to get far more bloody. The more the West pushes to integrate parts of Ukraine into NATO, the more it incentivises Russia to continue taking territory. This is a point they speak on, that the more they incentivise, Ukraine is on a irreversible path to NATO membership, this incentivises Russia to go, well, if that is true, then we need to take more and more and more, linking back into that this will then be settled on the battlefield. Dugan explains that a realist is someone who not only considers their own position, but also understands and accounts for the perspective of the other side. And this, of course, goes into being a strategist and being able to understand what your adversary is thinking. Mearsheimer also warns that it is extremely dangerous to push Russia into a close alignment with China, who is emerging as the dominant power in Asia. And this is something we have spoken about a hell of a lot, that regardless of how this war ends, I do believe in the future America will try and have a relationship with Russia due to the dominance that China is currently having in many sectors, both economically and militarily as well. So take all that away, try and remember that the most, and then I want to talk about what Mark Rutte says in this, and this is going to link back with what we said in the very opening to this video as well. So this was delivered on the 12th of December in Brussels. I'll be honest, the security situation does not look good. It's undoubtedly the worst in my lifetime, and I suspect yours too. From Brussels, it takes 1 day to drive to Ukraine. 1 day. That's how close the Russian bombs are falling. It's how close the Iranian drones are flying, and not very much further the North Korean soldiers are fighting. Every day, this war causes more devastation and death. Every week, there are 10,000 killed or wounded on all sides in Ukraine. Over 1 million casualties since February 22. And I believe, I said this in 2022, I said the time this war is ended, and if it is settled on the battlefield, which I believe it will be, because I agree with Mearsheimer's assessment that what Putin has put forward, no American administration will agree with, but what is being presented as far as NATO membership, I don't agree that that Putin's government will agree to either, that there will be 1 million dead, not casualties, that there will be 1 million people killed by the time this war ends. A lot of people criticise me for having like a big shift in my view on this war in mid-2023, basically lining up with the counteroffensive. And the reason for this, really, I'm speaking to you, the reason for this was I saw that this war is just protracted. it's now impossible. It's just going to grind men down until whoever's left. It doesn't matter who's right at this point. It matters who's left. I had very high hopes for that, and seeing that fell flat at the time where Ukraine had the best training, the best vehicles, and the best morale, significantly better than right now, and how that didn't have the achievements people thought it would have, my opinion shifted there to this is just a grind of men at this point. He's trying to wipe Ukraine off the map. He's trying to fundamentally change the security architecture that has kept Europe safe for decades. He's trying to crush our freedom and way of life. What I will say here is I think this is a bit of shifting responsibility. I believe the politicians in Europe have crushed their way of life 1,000 times of what Putin has, at least so far. If you ask, I think, a lot of Europeans about what has changed the architecture and freedom and way of life within Europe, Putin might be on that list, but it'll be a lot lower than a lot of other problems that have been caused from these politicians. He says Russia's economy is on a war footing, although we were told it was collapsing. In 25, the total military spending will be 7 to 8% of GDP, if not more. Go and watch my video with a doctor in economics if you want to see if that is going to collapse an economy or not. It's a third of Russia's state budget. It's the highest level since the Cold War. And Russia's defence industry is producing huge numbers of tanks, armoured vehicles and munition. What Russia lacks in quality, it makes up for in quantity, with the help of China, Iran and North Korea. Remember, quantity is a quality of its own. The problem with the Western military industrial complexes is because these are private, which I'm a huge fan of, privatisation, capitalism, but within the military, the money comes from R&D and developing tech, not just from hard quantity of systems. But these paragraphs in here, this is what the average person is very confused about. For years, we'd been told that Russia is or is going to be defeated, that they're right on the cusp, or they have already been. And then we hear things like this. We heard that they were defeated for 5 decades. He says this points in one clear direction. Russia is preparing for long-term confrontation with Ukraine and with us being confrontation with NATO. Now, I spoke there about, I think, that the internal changes within Europe are far more from politicians there than maybe Putin there. And I saw this today from War Monitor, who I've disagreed with a lot. But this is going to go into the next part about Mr. Rutte's speech. Western society became so advanced and progressive, it has sacrificed its foundational values, and now progressivism is eating it from within. Argue with the wall. That can link back to ideology that promises a utopia will do evil things. And it also goes into this paragraph here, of which I spoke about. I think politicians in Europe, they've changed their way of freedom and their way of life more so than any external influence at this point in time. And it needs to be said at this point in time. It says Putin believes that a serious, irreconcilable struggle is unfolding for the formation of a new world order. We need to be clear-eyed about China's ambitions. China is substantially building up its forces, including nuclear weapons, with no transparency and no limitations. From 200 warheads in 2020, China is expected to have more than 1,000 nuclear weapons by 2030. So within the decade, they want 1,000 deliverable nuclear warheads. Not just have them, they want them deliverable. China also has a lot of what we call nuclear entanglement, which is nuclear weapons at the same position of conventional systems, that strikes on those could be seen as strikes against then nuclear systems. Russia, China, and North Korea and Iran are hard at work to try and weaken North America and Europe. I don't disagree with this, but I think, again, it's our actions that are weakening this tenfold or more. Now, from my reading, my research, and my opinion, and I've shared this many times, China and Russia believe that there is a struggle for the unfolding or formation of a new world order. If you listen to Dugan, he will call this the theory of a multipolar world. But I don't believe any of this, especially China, is going to be done through military actions. I believe that China think that they can have this over a long period of time, over the next decades or century, without a shot being fired. I believe that they see it is the internal weakening of the West through the reliance on the dollar and the de-dollarization of some countries, and especially Putin, and he says this openly, about progressive liberal ideals weakening the West greatly. And that goes into why I showed you what War Monitor had said, that they ultimately believe that these progressive liberal ideals are going to be the way that the West loses its influence around the world. Therefore, that Russia and China, especially China in this, will then gain more global influence. Especially Putin and Lavrov, they speak about this multipolar world a lot, and that the end of the unipolar world, Mearsheimer also agrees that we have ended the unipolar world with just American hegemony at the top, and that we're at the beginning of a multipolar world. How that looks, we don't know. But as countries then develop further and further, there's less and less influence, and the de-dollarization of BRICS is a huge step if that were to occur. Again, reference back to me speaking to an economist about the effect that would have on American power and influence. He says, not to create a fairer one, but to secure their own spheres of influence. They're testing us and the rest of the world is watching. We're not at war, but we're certainly not at peace either. I want to be clear. There is no imminent military threat to our 32 allies because NATO has been transforming to keep us safe. Defence spending has gone up, innovation has accelerated, we have more forces at high readiness, larger and more frequent military exercises, more troops and hardware on our eastern flank, and with Finland and Sweden, more NATO allies. With all this, our deterrence is good for now. But it's tomorrow I'm worried about. We're not ready for what's coming our way in 4 to 5 years. If you think that Russia threatens NATO in this very short period, my question is, if the industry development is going that quickly as he says, it does raise the question of, well, is a victory for Ukraine going back against that? If it's going to threaten NATO as a whole, it does raise the question of, well, what hope is there? Danger is moving toward us at full speed. What is happening in Ukraine could happen here too. Regardless of the outcome of this war, we will not be safe in the future unless we're prepared to deal with danger. Again, Mearsheimer and Dugin, especially Dugin, they both agree, while Russia is formidable, there is nowhere near a powerful enough force to contemplate invading NATO. And I agree with that massively. It links back into what I've set up here. I do not believe that Russia and China see their way to being dominant in the global order through military actions. They see it through the West losing its global influence and internal division. Our defence industry here in Europe has been hollowed out by decades of underinvestment and narrow national industrial interests. When our continent was at peace, our defence became an optional extra. As a result, our industry is too small, too fragmented, and too slow. Especially Europe, they relied on US for security, Russia for gas, China for electronics for too low. And in this period of the development, in domestic development then has become so expensive that to produce in massive volumes is very, very difficult. Meanwhile, Russia's arms factory are churning out war equipment around the clock, and despite heroic efforts of our Ukrainian friends, Russia is reconstituting its forces much quicker than we had anticipated. They are learning fast from the battlefield. China's military industrial base is growing. China is acquiring high-end weapon systems and equipment 5 to 6 times faster than the US, and the US outpaces Europe by tenfold as well. It is heavily investing in munitions, accelerating space capabilities, and expanding its nuclear arsenal, I repeat, without any transparency or limitations. Remember, China has not signed or ratified any of these deals. China is also challenging our technological edge by investing massively in the disruptive technologies of tomorrow, including AI, quantum computing, and space. And this will help China with planning, command and control, and targeting. One thing I will say with this idea behind no transparency or limitations, we can see with what's happening all around the world in different areas that these signed deals and these treaties and whatever are just ignored anyway. So if you bought it to Xi Jinping, you might go, but you've ignored it, Russia ignored it, whatever. Why would we bother? Russia and China are racing ahead. We risk lagging behind. If we boost our industry, we can outpace our competitors. Now, I do highly doubt that the West, just in general, can meet the industrial output of dumb weapons that China can. Our strength is with development and creation of new weapons, and that's what you get in a free democracy, is creativity. But you see the Soviet Union. a lot of the new systems were developed by America, but the analogues were created en masse by the communists. China's naval industry is faster and larger than the rest of the world combined. It is unbelievable how much they are just pumping out in this. Quality, well, that can be questioned, but like I said, if we go into an extended war, and I've said this, protracted war, it will turn attritional. It's called the day after. That China and America have the ability to basically wipe out all the communications and satellites and whatever. That day after campaign, that attritional campaign, is going to matter just who has what. And the problems China has of a naval blockade or other things can be alleviated, and grain can be alleviated by Russia. This is the point I made earlier, why I believe that regardless of how this war ends, there's going to be a period of difficulty between the US and Russia, but I believe long term the US still need to have some influence there because of what Mearsheimer has said about being very careful about, or extremely dangerous to push Russia into closer alignment with China. Rutte says, we have also committed to accelerating the growth of defence industrial capacity and producing. We also already committed to accelerating growth of We also already have committed to accelerating the growth of defence industrial capacity and production across the alliance. To governments, I say, give our industries the big orders and long-term contracts they need to rapidly produce more and better capabilities. Embracing risk requires you governments to change outdated procurement rules and can reconsider your detailed national requirements. With 1 million casualties on your doorstep, you have no time to waste. Again, this should have been done years ago. To defence industry, I say, you need to do everything you can to keep us safe. There's money on the table and it will only increase. So dare to innovate and take risks. Come up with solutions to the swarms of drones and other new war tactics. Put in extra shifts and new production lines. So a lot of money going that way. War is a racket. And finally, to the citizens of NATO countries, especially in Europe, I say, tell your banks, your pension funds, it is simply unacceptable that they refuse to invest in the defence industry. So going on to a massive war footing in NATO and the EU. And this can be a way too to speed up the economy in the EU that is struggling also. And this brings me to my main point, defence spending. During the Cold War, Europeans spent far more than 3% of their GDP on defence. With that mentality, we won the Cold War. The Cold War was won because Russia was trying to compete, or the Soviet Union was trying to compete with that massive defence spending and an internal collapse from there, which is what I believed that was the tactic again in this war. But what was greatly overestimated was Russia's ability to backfill what had been lost via sanctions and ability to maintain a 7-8% defence spending. Again, I refer you to my interview with an economist. A decade ago, allies agreed it was time to invest in defence. Once again, the benchmark was 2%. By 2023, NATO allies agreed to invest at least 2%. I can tell you, we're going to need a lot more than 2%. And everyone said that Trump was the bad guy when he said, this is what we need. I know spending more on defence means spending less on other priorities, but it's only a little less. On average, European countries easily spend up to a quarter of their national income on pensions, health and social security systems. We need a small fraction of that money to make our defences much stronger and to preserve our way of life. So again, give and take. There is a finite amount of money, because without strong defence, there is no lasting security. And without security, there is no freedom for our children and grandchildren. No schools, no hospitals, no business. Those who lived through the Second World War know this, and our Ukrainian friends are living it every day. Legends, I don't even know what I've gone through today. My head is absolutely fried. If this doesn't make sense, I apologise. I can redo it at some point, but not today. The point I wanted to make was more along the lines of, is there going to be like military action between NATO and Russia? If NATO is saying that Russia is able to do that, well, that throws everything that has been said in the last 3 years about Russia's reduction in power out the bloody window and the ability to recover. That's where people are confused, especially with China. And China, they're making out like this is this massive imperialist goal. I believe China want, to be at the helm of the world, of the global order. But I believe they see their way there is through hybrid warfare, unconventional warfare, unrestricted warfare, but then not needing to fire a shot, not literally, but without needing to fire a shot can end up there due to reduction in influence in the West through, at this point in time, I get progressive liberalist ideals, especially in Europe. I think many see as that ideology that's reducing the influence and power other countries willing to work and internal strength and cohesion too. Have a great day. I'll speak tomorrow. Thank you.